This is a position reached in a recent round 5 game in the Australian Open of 2013 between International Master Andrew Brown of Canberra and International Master Moulthun Ly of Queensland. White's just played the move h3, attacking your bishop on g4. What would you do here with the black pieces? Good evening everyone, this is another YouTube video presented by Firego7, and in today's game we're going to be looking at the round 4 clash in the Australian Open between International Master from Canberra Andrew Brown, rated 2261 FIDE, versus International Master Moulthun Ly from Queensland, rated 24/7 on the FIDE rating list. This was a big counter and a lot of interest was in this game because both these players are rapidly improving. So Brown opens up with d4 and Moulthun Ly plays d5, a classical system against this d4 opening. c4 putting pressure on the d5 pawn, and now Moulthun Ly chooses c6 going into the Slav territory. Slav's a pretty good opening to try, and I really recommend for anyone who wants to improve at chess, try the Slav out. It's a good opening to have in your repertoire. Knight c3. This is a little bit unusual. Normally white players play knight f3 before knight c3 with the idea of stopping e5. Now e5 is playable here in this position, but Moulthun Ly doesn't choose to play. Instead he chooses to steer the path back into normal lines with knight f6. White's turn, knight f3, and now we just have a transposition back to the normal position in Slav. a6, interesting move. Not normal. Normally e6, or you can even take the pawn. e6 is more probable, and the computer's already saying that this is slightly better for white, but a6 is certainly playable. I don't think it's quite as bad as what the computer's saying. And the idea is, I think, to if left alone, black's just going to take the pawn on c4 and then use the pawn from b7 to b5 to protect his pawn. So how's white going to react? e3. This opens up the diagonal. So now the bishop can capture on c4 if this is possible. Although it is true that with the pawn on e3, the bishop on c1 is now hemmed in behind its own piece. Black's turn. b5. What a move, eh? So basically black's saying, alright, if you don't do anything white, I'm just going to take this pawn. So the pawn on c4 has to decide what its future is going to be. It has a few choices. Take on d5 if it wants to, take on b5, or it can take on push past c5 if it wants to. Although it can't be too bad, but yeah, interesting. I personally would probably take on d5 in this position. b5, interesting idea. a6, b5 here, with pressure on the pawn. Alright, so now it's white's turn. Let's see what happens. White just decides to play conservatively and just defend the pawn on c4, and this maintains the tension on these two squares without resolving it. It's an interesting way to play it. Clearly Andrew Brown doesn't fear the move b5 to b4, and where his knight would have to move, and giving black the possible e4 square with the knight. So he must have an idea for this knight. b4, where would the knight move? I suppose knight a4 springs to mind. Why not? Even possibly knight e2, but this doesn't look quite as good because the c4 pawn might have a few difficulties. But I think knight a4 should be okay. Anyway, we'll see how Moulthun Ly decides to meet this challenge of just defending the c4 pawn with the b3 pawn. Bishop g4. Okay. So what does he want to do with this move? Well, the first thing we look at is the bishop's on g4. It's pinning the knight on f3. Now the queen on d1. Can't move. Well, the knight can't move without losing the queen, so it creates a pin. Second thing he's doing is he's bringing out his bad bishop this is the bad bishop because all the pawns here are on light squares. So this makes the bad bishop. And so if the bad bishop gets outside the pawn chain, imagine if this pawn was on e6, that's the bad bishop outside the pawn chain. So he can always swap it off for the knight, and if it was inside the pawn chain, this bishop was still on c8, this would always be a problem for him. So that makes a little bit of sense for improving the harmony of the black pieces. What else does it do? Well, it clearly stops knight e5 from being played, and it develops a piece, and developing a piece can never really be wrong, I don't think, in the opening. So anyway, let's see what Andrew Brown does against this move. Bishop e2. So far, nice and simple moves. Conservative protection of the knight on f3, just as like we saw the conservative protection on c4, and just a nice sensible move. It just aims to break the pin. Now the bishop allows this knight to move. The knight can move without losing the queen, and so e5 is possible. So it's a good move, bishop e2. It also helps the king to castle quickly. That's important. It is important to develop as fast as you can in a game of chess, especially if the center can be opened up quickly, which in this case it's not probably true, but there's always the chance with pawn tension that exchanges can occur. So let's see what happens. Moulthun Ly, after this move, he decides to play e6, and now we see how his strategy is developed here, where he has that bad bishop outside the pawn chain. A very strange formation, but in his opening: a6, b5, a6, b5, c6, d5, e6. This pawn structure, yeah, it's almost like a beginner's pawn structure with the Great Wall of China or something. But it seems sort of playable. Can't be too bad. The thing about it is that he's got a good bishop on the dark squares, and it's not easy for white to get their bishop into the game. So I don't think there's anything really wrong with the way Blake's played this position. I mean, we look at the engine; it says equal anyway, and I think that's pretty reasonable. White has three pieces developed. Blake only has two, but it's not huge because there's no real attacks on the king yet. So let's see what happens now. h3. So he pops the question to the bishop on g4 and says, alright, you're either going to retreat that bishop or you're going to be forced to exchange it. Now what's Black going to do? Black has a couple of choices. If they exchange the bishop for the knight on f3, the first thing we notice is that now white gets the bishop pair, which is always a slight advantage long term positionally. The second thing we should know is that if Black retreats, we're going to look at potential attacks. So if we can retreat to f5, g4 may be a problem, but I think the bishop will be reasonably safe on f5. I don't think g4 is going to be a huge issue. Whereas if we retreat to h5, again g4 is going to be a problem, but there's added threats that now maybe knight e5 could potentially cause a few issues, especially if this queen knight on b7, b8 goes to d7. So you want to remember those sort of things, remembering that a knight e5 with the bishop on h5 is going to be a discovered attack along the d1 to h5 diagonal. Anyway, so the bishop's got to make a decision. Let's see what Moulthun Ly decides to do. He decides to chop, and that's a sensible decision. Alright, you give white the two bishops, but you don't have any problems with your bishop now. No real drama, but it does lead to slight advantage to white, and this is reflected in the engine analysis, which is giving us a slight edge to white. So the two bishops long-term compensation here. Bishop on c1 and bishop on f3. If the position becomes opened up, bishops could become very dangerous. So let's see how Moulthun Ly replies after bishop f3.